When we talk about international affairs, we usually zero in on ideas. We argue freedom against authoritarian rule, open economies against planned ones, Western ideals against other traditions. Those arguments fill headlines and expert discussions. They seem crucial, but they pull our focus away from something much older and much stronger than any belief or policy platform. There is one element in global strategy that trumps ideology, growth statistics, or defense budgets. It never shifts. Leaders change, parties switch, markets surge or crash, but this element remains constant. That element is geography. It doesn't deliver addresses. It doesn't campaign. It doesn't join talks. Yet it influences more than any statesman ever can, because over time, geography always comes out on top. Americans tend to downplay this because their geography has been exceptionally favorable. A huge continent loaded with resources, shielded by two immense oceans, bordered by peaceful and less powerful countries north and south. That arrangement offers a rare advantage, the sense that distance and time are reliably in your corner. You feel you can pick when to get involved and when to stay out. Asia has never known that advantage. Asia is a densely filled space with ancient nations squeezed together, and one nation dominates the area, China. For millennia, every society from Vietnam to Korea, Japan to the nations of Southeast Asia has confronted the same unchanging fact. China isn't a short-term issue you fix. China isn't a tough period you endure. China is the neighbor who will always live next door. The United States only became a dominant force in Asia after World War II. It provided protection, commerce, structure, and the region truly valued it. But deep down, there's a shared view almost never voiced openly. America is the appreciated guest. China is the family member who never leaves. This unspoken reality stands out most sharply in a nation many wouldn't guess, Australia. Today I want to lay out the hidden reasoning guiding every key capital across Asia. It isn't spelled out in any pact. It isn't proclaimed in briefings. Yet it influences every significant choice being made right now. And it centers on one truth: the neighbor who will remain forever. Leaders throughout Asia recognize something Washington often finds difficult to grasp. In 50 or 100 years, America might choose to retreat across the Pacific, concluding the ocean is too vast, internal priorities too pressing, the commitment no longer worthwhile. That's not judgment, it's simply precedent. America has stepped back before, but in 1,000 years, China will still occupy the same spot. That's not politics. That's geography. Australia experiences this conflict more acutely than most. Culturally Western, historically Western, politically Western, it shares language, systems, and heritage with Britain and America. Yet it faces Asia across a slim stretch of water. Economically, its success depends overwhelmingly on China. Iron ore, coal, gas, farm products, tuition fees. Beijing is easily its top customer. The U.S. lags far behind. Fully breaking with China would wreck Australian livelihoods and quality of life. So Canberra wrestles with dual anxieties, being deserted by America and being dominated by China. Publicly, it speaks firmly, joins defense agreements, acquires advanced arms. Privately, strategists pose the question seldom asked aloud. If serious conflict arises in 20 years, would an American leader actually risk Los Angeles for Sydney? No one can say for sure. What everyone can say for sure is that China will remain right there. Southeast Asia adopts an even more realistic outlook. They live on China's front step. They recall 1975, helicopters rising from Saigon rooftops, America exiting. They recall the Cold War, making their region a proxy battlefield. They follow bamboo diplomacy. Flex strongly in the gale, never fracture. They won't create armed coalitions against China not from fondness, but from necessity. Vietnam clashed with China in 1979 and still harbors mistrust. Yet China is its primary trade partner. ASEAN crafted the world's biggest trade pact and ensured China was included while America was not. When Washington retreats from trade leadership, Asia recalibrates. When China constructs railways and ports that can't be undone every 4 years, Asia pays attention. This is the underlying truth of our time. Asia wants America to stay active as a counterbalance, not as an overlord insisting on absolute allegiance. The soundest approach for the United States is to acknowledge geography, compete earnestly, present appealing options, and honor that no nation here will wage war against a neighbor it can never relocate from. Because in Asia, geography doesn't bargain. It simply persists. And here, geography means coexisting with China, the neighbor who will always stay. Zealand would be the only Western nations in an entirely Asian sea. This worry creates a foreign policy that frequently looks inconsistent. On one side, figures like former Prime Minister Paul Keating insist that Australia must secure its future within Asia. They argue for closer ties with the region, particularly Indonesia and Southeast Asia. On the other side, Australia's defense community stays firmly linked to the United States. They hold tight to partnerships like AUKUS not because they're flawless, but because they provide comfort and stability in an unpredictable landscape. Yet behind the official statements, Australian experts recognize a hard reality. America is distant. China is immediate. One of Australia's top strategic minds, Hugh White, has cautioned that the country is holding onto a fantasy. The fantasy that America will stay the leading force in Asia forever and that China can be forced to accept second place. He calls this hope triumphing over sound strategy. In private conversations, Australian officials pose a question they almost never ask publicly. If serious trouble breaks out in 20 years, would an American leader truly put Los Angeles on the line for Sydney? The answer is unknown. What is known is that China will remain exactly where it is. That's why, no matter the friction or tough talk, Australia will never fully cut connections with Beijing. It simply can't bear the cost. Australia has to figure out how to coexist with the neighbor, who will always be there. If Australia feels uneasy, Southeast Asia takes a more practical approach. The ASEAN nations live right on China's threshold. They lack any buffer of distance. They've experienced superpower competition before and recall the price. They recall the Cold War. They recall when their region turned into a proxy field for rival beliefs. They recall the destruction in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And they recall one year especially vividly, 1975, the year America pulled out of Vietnam. The sight of helicopters rising from the U.S. Embassy roof in Saigon is etched in the region's shared memory. It delivered a harsh truth. The United States is a democracy. Its overseas commitments follow public mood. When voters tire, America heads home. It headed home from Vietnam. It shut bases in the Philippines. It departed Afghanistan. China, on the other hand, does not head home. China shares land borders with Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar, and sea borders with the rest of Southeast Asia. That's why ASEAN follows what people call bamboo diplomacy. Bamboo sways in strong winds, but never snaps. ASEAN won't build military coalitions against China, not out of affection, but out of necessity. They have to share the neighborhood. Vietnam shows this thinking clearest of all. It clashed with China in 1979. It still carries old distrust. Yet today China is Vietnam's biggest trade partner. Vietnam has warmed relations with the United States, but it will never sign up for a formal anti-China bloc. The explanation is straightforward. American ships drop by from time to time. Chinese presence is there every single day. ASEAN's approach isn't containment. It's entanglement. Tie China in with commerce, talks, and shared frameworks. That's why ASEAN pushed the world's biggest free trade deal, making sure China was in and the United States was out. When Washington stepped back from leading Asian trade, Southeast Asia shifted again. It learned that U.S. focus can wander. China's doesn't. This view of America as a guest gets stronger from political swings. To Asian eyes, Washington moves like a pendulum. One team signs global deals. The next pulls out. One leader pushes cooperation. The next walks away. That unpredictability complicates long-range plans. Asian leaders plan in decades, often generations. They can't base 50-year visions on 4-year voting cycles. China's approach to the region, by comparison, has stayed remarkably steady. For years it has emphasized roads, links, and economic ties. That's the real point of efforts like the Belt and Road. They're not just business ventures. They're markers of lasting presence. A train line can't be canceled. A harbor doesn't switch sides. When China lays tracks across Southeast Asia, it roots itself in land. Defense promises matter, but they're intangible. Built projects are tangible. Asian leaders see the difference. In trouble, American troops might show up. Chinese sway is already there. This imbalance counts. It shows Asian leaders which way history is moving, and in Asia history moves toward the neighbor who stays forever. So what does this mean for the Asia-Pacific ahead? It doesn't mean Asia wants America to exit. Quite the opposite. Most nations here want America to stay involved. They want U.S. ships keeping trade routes safe. They want U.S. capital. They want U.S. innovation. They want America as a counterweight, not as a boss. There's a big distinction. The time when America could set all the rules in Asia is fading. Not because America stumbled, but because China has risen again. Asia won't turn into an American domain or a Chinese one. The Pacific won't belong to any single power. It will be shared. Asian nations will navigate skillfully. They'll lean on American protection to offset Chinese strength, and Chinese growth to offset American inconsistency. But they will never sign on to a campaign to wipe China out, because they know it's impossible. China isn't a made-up empire. It's a civilization. It has collapsed before and rebuilt itself. The smartest path for the United States is to face this fact, compete strongly without trying to push China out of its own backyard, provide better options, reconnect on trade, honor Asian independence. If America follows that, it will always have a place in Asia. But if it insists on full allegiance while delivering uncertainty, Asia will simply adapt. Geography doesn't debate. It lasts. And in Asia, geography means sharing space with China, the neighbor who will always be home.